Hey Gil, I don't know if you hear me, but this is Germany calling. There is a problem with your sound.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Right. Sorry about that, Michael.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Now, a project. I will show you what Acre Desktop does later on, but a project is essentially all the code and all the assets that you require for the development of your application. Or if you're developing a library, same thing there. All the code, all the assets, all the documents, DLLs, executables that you rely on for your application or library. And in terms of what it looks like, it would be a folder on your file system. So that's your project. And that's what you want to be able to work on. It should be self-contained in a way. A package, now the distinction between a project and a package is a little bit vague, but the idea of a package is simply a project that is consumed by other projects. So you want to have a project and deliver it as a tool to other users, a module, if you like. A package is basically a small, wrapped, self-describing package that you can distribute to other people and for other people to consume. APM is what I will refer to when I talk about a project manager. Now, Acre Desktop is a project manager. So when I use the term APM, I'm referring to any framework that framework that has implemented a project management tool. That didn't sound right. Yeah, so a project manager is what helps you deal and work with a project. And I'll refer to it as APM in this presentation. The APR, again, is the place that I envisage we will have packages. It's a package repository. It's a library of tools that you can interact with. Okay, I've already talked a little bit about that, but essentially a workspace today is where you would put all your code. It's a binary file, and if you save it with a specific version of Dialog, it's not backwards compatible, so you can't load it with another older version of the interpreter, which makes it a bit awkward when you're working on a development and you want to adopt new interpreters, but maybe other users are still working on an older version, and you want it to be backwards compatible. So saving a workspace in a DWS file is inconvenient. It's not as flexible. And also, of course, if you're trying things out and you work in your on your application, you run code and it creates potentially some variables or modifies the state. And if you then save it, you risk polluting your workspace. So it's not a good place to keep your code base. And Morten has already talked about why it's great to put things on source files and external text files. So this is nothing new. It's just the idea of moving away from working with a binary file as your code repository is not great. And it can quickly lead to a mess like this.
Everything's easily reachable.
Great. Now, this is just ideas, of course. Nothing of this is implemented. But if there was a way to define a workspace in a configuration file and potentially also set things like IDE properties or configuration settings that you often that you want to be defining upfront, Now, John Scholes mentioned, for example, when he's demoing code, he wants to have a few things set, like a larger font size, maybe a specific color theme. Maybe there are some system variables like autocomplete that you want to turn on or off specifically for a session. So being able to configure that in a workspace together with what projects you want to work on makes it a little bit more powerful than the current workspace that we have today. Yeah, Adam?
How's that not just the session workspace file?
Because this would allow you to have multiple different workspaces that define the projects that you want to work on, as well as the environment settings that you want to have for that workspace.
I don't know, what is it in a saved session that doesn't allow you? That's exactly a session. You load the session, you have as many session files as you want, load the one you want to work on, it loads everything in, all the fonts and all the settings and all the menu bars and whatever language you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's still a binary file, so it's very difficult to version and edit.
That's one of the things. And the other thing is the projects that I want to work on. So if I want to be able to set up 2 different environments, for example, where I develop, I'm in the Dialog Tools group, and I typically load Conga isolates and I don't know what other JSON server projects. I typically open all of them because I need to dabble with all of them at the same time. I can configure a workspace file to load those projects in and to set some specific IDE settings for colors and fonts, etc. And when I open that file, it's like walking into your workshop. You might have different workshops and you don't need to worry about changing the settings every time or moving the session file like you suggested. And also if you wanted to share that workspace file with others, source code manage it for whatever reason, you could do that because it's a simple text file and you could easily edit it. And
technically, you could even do all these things in a workspace or in source code as it is today. It's just a little bit awkward.
Yeah. So this is just an idea for moving forward. And you end up with a tidier desktop.
Very skeptical of anybody who's desktop.
It was tidy. Right, so yeah, it would be good if we used a standard file extension for that, so we could create file associations, meaning you can double click a workspace file like you can now, and it would just load everything in and start your interpreter.
I'm worried about the reuse of the word workspace for this. And then now we have 3 different definitions of workspace. 4.
Yeah, I know. We talked about this, Morten. I don't really know what to do about this because I can't think of a better way of describing what I'm trying to achieve. It's just unfortunate that it's been overloaded. If you have a better...
Is this not a project?
Yeah. Oh, we'll get to that. Oh, sorry. Right, so essentially, here's just an example of what that could look like. It's not... Yeah, I'm not particularly happy about the full pass there, but it's a way of defining the projects that you want to have loaded with this workspace. And it yeah, JSON or YAML. Again, this is something we discussed. It's a little bit unfortunate that as soon as Dialog implements a system function like quad XML, we look at JSON and think that's better. So now that we have quad JSON, people think, well, YAML is a little bit nicer, isn't it? It's yes, I agree. It's a little bit easier to express things there in YAML.
Right, it's not doing system
Right, so what's a project then? Well, I've outlined some of the things that might be contained in a project. but essentially it comes back to the same thing, that you want to have some configuration file describing what the project is, a name, a version. It will have to be in the root of the project folder, so it's an easy standard way of finding the configuration for the project, the properties of the project. Maybe properties is a better name. If the configuration of a project is then defining the dependencies that it has on other packages available in the cloud, then it can be used to drive the tools to bring in those dependencies and load them into the project. And if we take a look at an example of that, we've got, it's hard to read, isn't it? I've taken an example from the Apple Teams OS package. It's a tool giving you some methods for querying the operating system features. It's operating system level methods. I mean, for those of you that have used Node, this is just a copy of their configuration files for packages. The properties are exactly or very similar. In some cases, exactly the same. But you have a name of the package, a version number using semantic versioning, so major, minor, and patch elements. And then it's got a repository property pointing to the GitHub repository, so anyone using this could quickly get to the GitHub repository to either clone it and contribute, or just look at the documentation for that package on the repository. We have defined a couple of scripts here, test and build, which, again, the idea being that we have standard properties in the project configuration file that tells the consumer, or makes it easy for the user of this package to run the test cases without knowing anything about the package. So being able to just say, run all the tests, and letting the author define what happens, what function is it going to call, what work does it need to do to run the test cases. Similarly with the build framework, so this is just an entry point for starting the build process, but the author of the package will have to define what that build process is and provide the tools to do that. Now for a test framework can be a package in itself. So just like Kai has done in the APL'18 repository, there's a tester class that you can use to run test cases on your application. Now that's a dependency on this project for the purpose of running the tests. So it's listed in the project configuration file as a development dependency, indicating that this is not required in that dependency, and well, to be able to run the test cases and do whatever else you need during the development. There's another development dependency here called WinSys, and apparently Kai, when he developed this class, he needed to access the Windows system methods potentially for the purposes of the test cases, just to query the Windows operating system for results of the test cases or whatnot. WinSys isn't used in the package in runtime, so it doesn't need it when it's delivered in and used in production. The two dependencies that it does have, APL'18 utils and files and dirs, will need to be available when you run this project. So if you use the OS package, you also need APL'18 utils and files and dirs. And just like with the version number here for this package, the dependencies will also need to be to define what version of the dependency that it requires. And semantic versioning allows you to specify how relaxed you are about the versioning. You can specify an explicit patch version, or you can give it a range of versions that you would be happy to accept. And that works only if authors of packages follow the semantic versioning rules or guidelines, which in simple terms is that the major version will need to be incremented if you're making a breaking change, meaning you remove a method or a functionality from the package and the users can't rely on upgrading without also changing their code. The minor patch version is if you add new features. So you extend the capabilities of the package. And the patch number, which is the third and last one, is simple bug fixes. So you're not changing the features, you're fixing a faulty feature. By defining these guidelines and rules, it's easier for a consumer of the package to say, I know I need Conga version 3.0. But of course, if they fix bugs, I want to bring in those latest bug fixes as well. So I'm not going to define 3.0, which would be very restrictive. I will allow any patch releases as long as the major and minor version numbers are 3 and 0. And if you're braver, you might say, well, I don't mind if they add new features. I'm happy to use version 3 as a major number. Any minor patch updates I'll happily take on.
In that case, we will still be on version 0.
Major version number 0 is, the guideline for that is that the API is not yet defined. Use at own risk. So when you're creating a new package, major version 0, until you have defined your API. Any future changes to that API will incur a change in the version number. Yeah?
In the dialog cookbook, we argued for multiple build files. It's to one in which you create your development file. So in the context of your slide tester and sys, and the other in which you build file for shape.
Yeah.
Clearly, you might have more build files for testing out the system.
Yeah.
Is there, in the framework you're envisaging, you accommodate that?
Yeah, and well, okay, there are two parts to this. If you're developing an application, you would typically need multiple build methods, because, as you say, you might want to ship it in various forms. If you're working on a library and you want to, like the isolates, if you want to be able to provide that as a package to be consumed by other projects, you don't need to build it, because the idea is that the package is a slimmer version of the project. Nothing more. It might be smaller. It's a what is it called? The project is a superset of the package. In Node, the approach is that if you find a git ignore file in the project root, it is used for the building of the package as well. So anything that's mentioned in git ignore is ignored when creating the package. You can also specify a dedicated npm ignore file, which is specific to the package management. So a package that you want to publish to the central repository, where you know that you don't want to include a certain folder or a certain file, you add it to your package repository configure ignore file. So you have a simple file that just says, don't include this. But there's no building, because the package What's the opposite of a superset?
Subset.
A subset, yes. So the package is a subset. You don't need to build anything for that. Right. The source code. Now, I'm not entirely fixed on this, but the source code for a project, there will be, I think it's a good idea to have the convention of putting all your APL source code in a specific folder, a subfolder of the project folder. So whether that's called APL source, like in Acre, or SRC because you're influenced by Node, or if you may have multiple folders that you want to bring in, I've not entirely decided on. I think in a way, I think a single folder for all your APL source code for this project should go in a single top-level folder. That means that your test functions, if they're in APL, would also go into your source folder because that is part of it. That's where I'm a little bit hesitant because I'd like to, yeah, I don't.
If your APL code, for example, generates web pages and wants to inject some pre-written JavaScript, where would you want to keep that file that contains the JavaScript?
I would keep it under assets. So another subfolder where you put static files, I call them. Morten didn't like the name.
Well,
but
some of them are static, but I just wanted to point out that there might be JavaScript file that is actually not source code. Some of those files, like the JavaScript or Python files, might be source code, but in a different program.
Yes, and that's where what I was trying to emphasize, that the source folder, the source code folder is the APL source folder, which is why Acre's naming is very explicit and good. APL source, only APL content. When we get array notation in version 18, and we can store constants as well, if they use the APL array notation, they would belong in the source code folder. Any other files, DLLs, pictures, HTML, CSS, anything that is consumed, like Adam said, if I use a template, it's a JavaScript file that I'm including when I dynamically build a web page. It would go in the assets folder, and it would be read from there by the APL code, but the APL source code doesn't.
I've wrote an application that we use internally where APL, it's run by from inside APL, but the APL application calls Node to execute some JavaScript. Would you also consider that such static content?
Yeah, I mean it's static from the point of view of APL. But you don't.
We do disagree there because you're explicitly saying that the source code may only be APL.
Yes, and there are two reasons for that. But if you think of the APL source folder as, when you talked about link, mapping to a namespace structure, it's a representation of your namespace structure in your active workspace. I don't like the idea of having static files that follow that structure in the namespace structure when there isn't.
Static, I might be editing them just as much as my APL.
Not from.
I might have a snippet of JavaScript that's actually something I'm editing as part of. I'm making a new release of my project. I'm editing the JavaScript.
But it is static in the sense that you're not dynamically changing it by the application.
Well, the APL source code also is not being changed.
Yes.
The APL source code is also static.
Yes, it's static. But what I'm saying is that the APL source goes into the APL source folder. Any other non-APL assets would go in the assets folder. So.
Okay. Well, yeah, I have a different model. I actually consider I could have a source folder that has APL and JavaScript and I think of them both as things I'm actively developing.
Yeah.
They're not separate projects to me at all.
It sounds to me like there's an unspoken premise in thinking. The APL interpreter is going to be the processor code.
Yeah.
And if you start from there, then your source code is naturally APL. And anything else, whatever it isn't actually source code in the context of the application.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been enjoying the last year working with KDB is the baked in into process communication. So even a dumb guy like me can write applications which have got multiple processes in it to talk to each other. And the search engine on the code.kx.com website consists of two KDB processes. It's easy for me now to envisage writing applications which will involve multiple processes running on multiple environments.
Yeah.
So I think I share no reservation about privileging the APL source code. I completely get you wanting to isolate that and match to the namespace structure.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I don't know how to best express this, but
something that doesn't belong to the project, it's something I'm using that somebody, some other project.
Yeah.
DLL typically would be that, but even a DLL might be something that, I look at C code and I edit it and I compile it and I call it.
You're saying if you're working on a project where the DLL, development of the DLL is the same project as what's consuming it. I disagree for two reasons. You may make changes to the DLL because you're fixing a bug and it might be related to only that project, but I still believe that that should be set up as a separate project.
Don't see why. Yeah, I mean, if it's a DLL that I'm writing that's shared by other projects, yeah, it should be a separate project.
Even if it isn't.
If I've written, I've got this monolithic APL system, I found out there's a hotspot, I decide I'm going to rewrite one APL function, C++ to make it run fast. One function.
Okay, you're saying you're developing a DLL that is only used in your own project internally.
It's only used by me. It's a fast version of some APL function.
Yeah.
I have a button I can press that compiles it in my build process, compiles it into a DLL, and then I load it. And it's only me.
And even if that's the case, I still think that it should go into a separate folder. So you have a dedicated APL source folder. I mean, the other part of this is that APL, at the moment, the dialog interpreter doesn't allow you to have a, what is it called? If you open a folder, as you do with link, you don't see, in the interpreter, you don't see all the content of that folder as it appears in the file system. Even if you try to map the namespace structure, there isn't a one-to-one map.
Maybe it's a good idea to keep it in a separate folder. It's not a static file. It is a source file in my project.
Right.
C source and Java source and script source and whatnot.
So if the argument is just about the static, I put double quotes around static. So any other assets that you use go anywhere else, and there isn't a restriction on having this in a folder called assets. I just group them into a node here saying these are external to APL. These are referenced by APL, but not part of the APL source code. You could have 5 different folders if you like, if you want to construct your project as such. You could have a C source code folder, a C distribution, or what's it called, the build folder. But from the point of view of the APL, I don't believe that those files would go into the APL source code folder. I'd like that distinction. Similar with dependencies. There, if I work on a project that has dependencies on other packages, those packages do not end up as part of my APL source code because that folder is dedicated to only code related to this project and not others. So packages brought in are kept in a separate folder. Got 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, I wasn't.
It's going to be a very short demo.
Time, I was worried about
Again, the idea here is that we have a central repository. That central repository might be in-house, it might be in the cloud, it might be with a fallback. So you use the in-house version for anything that is private to your organization, but allow the developers to access packages from the global public repository. And it's basically where all the packages are. And there's a question of whether or not a project should have a copy, like a physical copy of those packages within the project folder or not. But I think it's a minor discussion. It wouldn't change much in the framework how that was solved. But the idea is that those packages are kept separate to the APL source. You wouldn't ship them with your project because they are dependencies. Okay, I take that back. You shouldn't ship that as a package. Your package shouldn't include other packages. It should only ship with its own source code. Dependencies are already in the central repository and can be fetched when you install this package. So therefore, there's a distinction with dependencies. Right, other folders that you might have is documentation or test files that are, I'm going to use the word static again. Any other files that you use for testing that are nice to group in a separate folder, but there is no imposed structure on the project folder apart from in the root, it should have a configuration file. It should have some source code in APL source code in a folder. And that's it. Everything else is in the project root. I think I'll just show an example of that, what that might look like in practice. So I will see if I can find, here's a local central package repository where I have created some packages from the Apple tree repositories as well as dialogues. So we've got Conga and JSON server brought in here. Couldn't find a version number for JSON server, so I just made one up. And if we look at one of those, I'll use the infamous or famous VS Code to look at one of these. Let's see. Right, so if we look at Conga, now this is a homebrew, so I've just taken what I thought would be useful, but we've got an assets folder that contains the dilib, what are they called, shared objects, resource. And then the source code, which is in an SRC folder. I used link to create this from whatever I found on the Conga repository in GitHub. I know you've started working on your own thingy there, but just as an exercise. And if we look at the, right, can I increase this? Ah, what happened?
you get that to work, I mean, the debuild file for Bundle is very complicated. A single link
Yeah.
Get anywhere close.
Okay, it's hard to read, but name Conga version 3.0, link to the repository, no dependencies, no development dependencies. It's a very simple package. It doesn't depend on anything else. It has a couple of shared object files and some source code. if we look at the JSON server, which depends on Conga, its configuration file lists Conga as a dependency, and I've specified 300 here explicitly, but essentially the only dependency is Conga. It's got a name and a version number, and that's it. In JSON server, we've got lots of other folders. We've got demos, distribution, Docker, sample. I've changed the source folder to SRC just to fit in with my little framework. And it's got 3 functions in it, or 3 files in it. There's a function called autostart, the class JSON server, and a function called updates that checks for updates from the repository. I haven't tested those. I just focused on trying to get JSON server up and running as a package. And if we start ride, can you see anything? Right. Okay, so if I wanted to use JSON server, I envisage we have a user command that lets me access the central repository. So an APR client, APL package repository client. And if I wanted to retrieve a package, I would do something like this. And it would check with the central repository if it found a Conga package. Because I have omitted the version number, it loads the latest or only version that is available. And it currently just output a line there saying, I've loaded Conga into hash.conga. Actually, it's pointing to where the actual source has been put. And I've just used an arbitrary namespace name here for demonstration purposes. But the idea being that in your active workspace, there's a dedicated namespace in the root that contains all the packages that you use. So we've got hash.apr, Conga 3.0, and if we check the structure of the active workspace now, we see that we have a namespace APR, Conga, with these functions and these classes here. And finally, we have another reference Conga, which points to this folder. The client, or the client has also created a little reference here for me, __dir, which is the project folder on the file system. And the idea of that is that the APL code can use this reference to access assets wherever they may be in the project folder. So if you have a DLL that the C program has built, I reference it by going __dir, where's my DLL? And you load it that way. I'm gonna clear the workspace and do the same exercise. This time I will load the JSON server. And similarly, we now see, actually, let's move that up a little bit. Right, so APR, Conga 3.0, JSON server 010. In here, you see that I've got the __dir, but I also have a reference Conga pointing to its dependency, which is here, right? In the root, I now have APR and JSON server, where JSON server points to the JSON server class, because in my package configuration file, I've said that if someone loads this project, as a default, I want them to get the reference to this object. in the root, you don't see anything else.
Again.
I'm sorry, yeah, you don't have to type JSON server, JSON server.
Yeah.
So the name of the project is JSON server. The class that you want to expose is JSON server, but you don't want to have to drill down into that. About 5 minutes before lunch, so. Now, does anyone remember how to create a JSON server?
I think JSON server.new is the easiest way.
So let's set the port, and then we've got code location, and I'll set that to a namespace here, C. So that's where I'll put my code. I'll create an echo, C echo function method, which takes an argument and returns the result. Yeah. And then I start my JSON server. And if I go to localhost, was it 8080? Yeah. I can see that there. Sorry, the method is echo. I type something in here. And send, and it worked. So I say.
And it didn't even touch the server. We usually use reverse to make it more convincing.
Yeah. Let's see if I can change that.
Just call it echo.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that, actually. I changed my mind. It's too hard to reverse. Right, so what changes did I have to make to get that working? There's two things that I'd like people to keep in mind. Sorry. Oh. When writing packages, avoid referencing hash. Don't make assumptions on where you will be loaded. Try to make it relocatable. Yeah? So with Conga and JSON server, well, if we think of the JSON server first, there's obviously a reference to Conga somehow, somewhere, right? So if we look for Conga, load Conga, there's a function there called load Conga, which I've modified slightly because it used to copy from a Conga workspace.
We didn't have a package management system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it used to copy from Conga. Why is that a problem? I mean, that should be safe, right? Except that with every new version of the interpreter, you get a new version of Conga, free of charge. You can upgrade Conga independently if you download it and replace the files in the installation directory, but there's no version control at all. So if you ship this, depending on Conga 3, and someone is using an older version of the interpreter that was shipped with an older version of Conga, that just doesn't work. And what Björn and the Dialog team have tried to do is be backwards compatible. So whichever version you're running this on, we'll make sure that Conga feels and looks the same. But if you had version control and a package management system, you could define that. You depend on Conga 3. And the change I've made is simply check for the existence of Conga under PM. The project space. Oops. Right. In the constructors of this class, when I create an instance, I know that the class itself is loaded into the active workspace somewhere. The package management framework makes sure that any dependency is created as a reference in the root of the project space. So if I'm working on a project, I can safely assume that my dependencies will exist in the root, and I'll be able to refer to them directly. So in the root of the JSON server project, I can assume that there will be an hash.conga available. If you remember, in the JSON server project, the root contained a class called JSON server. So I know that I can reference Conga from the same space that the class is in. And when you create an instance, you can say, well, what's the class of this instance? And it will return a reference to the class. And I can then say, take the parent of the class as the project space. That's the root of the project. This is awkward, because you need to really think about where you are in your project to know where the root of the project is. I'd like to have a better, safer way of defining that. But I think it's important. I mean, in a simple namespace structure in your project, you may know that if you're in hash.a.b.c, then you can refer back up 2 steps to get to the root of the project. But it's, again, a little bit ugly, especially if you're restructuring your code, moving a function from one place to another, and all of a sudden you're not as deep as you were before. You need to keep track of that. But anyway, we've run out of time. So in this specific project, I create a reference to the project space. I refer to the project space when I need to access dependencies. So wherever it references Conga, I now refer to it as ps.conga because I know that it will be available there when the package manager has done its job. And same thing happens in Conga, of course. So where are we? Right, I don't have a reference to Conga in the root because it's a dependency, but I can access it from here because I know that it will exist there, or I can access it directly. And where do we create the, oh, I can't remember where that happens now. There's a place where it's initializing Conga.
Let's see, this is number 3, so it's
connection.
New.
Sorry, init. Right. So same thing here. Here, is it?
Oh,
yeah. Load shared libs. That's it. Load shared libs needs to know where those files are. And lib path is now the project folder on disk assets. I know where they are, so I don't need to look for them.
Not sure that works on all platforms. There are nastinesses on I think I have picked that problem. You think you fix that? Yeah. So that is approach should work. Yeah. Cool. Wow, because that was a huge problem.
Thank you, Björn.
Saved by the bell.
Yeah, and finally, same approach here. I know that I'm creating an instance of this lib class, whatever it is, and I know that I can find a reference to Conga by referring to what class was this hash.
Horrible code starting at
Yeah, ignore that. That's not me.
No, but it shows the cost of backwards compatibility very clearly.
Yes. C is now Conga, and I can use it as I need.
Just tell us when we can stop with this backwards compatibility.
You can start yesterday.
3 versions.
Even.
have been using the last year or so a lot of Python code and have been running my Python package manager pip quite a bit. And the target of the Python package manager is the machine rather than the application or project. So if I upgrade a particular package, it gets upgraded for everything that uses it on the machine, which is kind of nice if all those packages actually work within the bug. It's fantastic.
Isn't there a flag for that? Or having
yeah, you can find manage the version control. Where it takes you as an application developer, as far as I can see, is that if before shipping your new versions, you're going to develop and test them within a virtual machine. Right?
Yeah.
Docker.
Yeah, the Docker is a solution.
Yeah, and so I was wondering if you consider, because I know you've been leaning towards package management for APL for some time, how you chose to make the target of the install the application of the project rather than the machine.
Right.
I don't think that's the case, right? The package manager, if there's a package manager running on the machine, it will maybe have multiple versions of whatever's on the upstream package. And it's only when you load it into a given workspace that it's the application.
If I understood it right, sorry, the question was if it built it on in runtime?
When I run pip and upgrade a particular package,
yeah,
that gets upgraded for my touch.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's a different package management system, but yeah, in the
You're not planning to do that, right?
no, in the scope of a project, if you wanted to upgrade dependencies, you would have to actively do that. They wouldn't automatically do it for you. And every time you ask for that to be done, it will follow the semantic versioning rules that you set out for your dependencies.
That's what I thought I understood from the targets. I was wondering how you chose between those two paths.
Between the two paths.
Those two strategies.
I mean,
Which
when
two
you're
paths?
mentioning with Python, it doesn't work, right? That's not the choice.
Because if you have two other projects on your machine and half of them works with one version and you have
Oh, right.
Okay.
The proposal here is that it will support multiple versions.
Yeah.
So yes, I shouldn't say too much. I think in Node at the moment, it's limiting you to one version of a package. It tries to resolve conflicts. And as in, because you're allowed to make a statement of what ranges of versions you're requiring as a dependency, it consolidates those. And if it can find a specific version that will fulfill all the requirements for all the dependencies and interdependencies, it will pick that one. Otherwise, it might throw an error saying, I can't do it. You need to change something here. You either can't use these two dependencies together, or you have to pick one and live with it.
But Node also does it for a project, right?
Yes, for a project. That's what I meant.
Not across all projects.
You can
to be located on this machine.
No, it's for it's on a project level.
Yeah.
So I mean, it sounds like that Python software more than one.
I don't know how they make their case doing it that way.
We need to take a break. They were adamant that we have to start at 12:30. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a delay.
No problem.
Paul, are you saying anything? Oh, okay, right. Right, Paul Mansour asked if we should have a convention for a folder structure for assets. And after our conversation during the presentation, I think the answer is that we won't have any restrictions on where you put things. But I still agree with Paul that a convention of putting, naming convention for folder structure for common things would be good. It's just difficult to adhere to if you have projects like what Morten showed with PyCharm, where you may have multiple different languages involved that do their own thing, and you have a very specific folder structure. So I guess the short answer is what Morten said, no. Okay, well, I'm just going to carry on for a little bit longer, showing a couple of other things, examples. But then I did offer Paul Manser to demo Acre Desktop himself. So if he does shout, I'll hand over to him. Otherwise, I'll try my best to demonstrate that as well. Right, let's see if we can hide this. And going back to this, right, so this was, before lunch, I just showed how a package manager could simplify getting started a little bit quickly with testing things. And the example I used was the Conga server and the JSON server using the Conga tools. And in the break for lunch, I spoke to Björn, who assaulted me with all the problems with this approach. And well, mainly he says that the DLLs required for Conga come in a variety, a dozen flavors, each of which is several megabytes in size. And essentially, if you had to deliver all of those DLLs with a single package, you'd end up delivering about 60 meg worth of DLLs, which is, of course, yeah, it's awkward. I don't have a straight answer. My gut feeling was that, yes, you do that anyway. And if you need to build a version of your application that depends on Conga, your build tool could ignore the DLLs that you don't need if you're building for a specific target interpreter platform version. So Unicode on Linux 64 bits, then you don't ship all the other ones that you don't need with your application. Because the concept is still to make it easy and cross-platform. So if I use Conga, I don't want to think about what I need specifically from Conga. I just need Conga in my active workspace. Right. Now, with this tool, you could, if you wanted to start playing around, you could load these dependencies into target namespaces as well. So a simple example of that would be to, sorry, I've got a Swedish keyboard here, but English layout, so I type things wrong sometimes. So if I have a namespace Gil and wanted to load Apple pre-utils because I'm used to those tools, and I specify the target as Gil, then, well, the minor difference here is that, as you can see, the reference is just created under Gil instead. Now, of course, if you're developing a new, if you're starting out a new project, you want to initialize the project with a folder and configuration files. And I'm envisaging that there will be a user command to initialize that and maybe prompt you for the details. So I want to create a new project. Okay, what's the name? What's the description of this project? And you just answer the questions if you know the dependencies or repository URL or whatever. You just fill in those details and it creates a folder for you, adds a configuration file and everything else that you need to get started. And in theory, if you did that, I'd like to see a user interface, a user command interface to add dependencies as well. So if you see something like, let's assume I've created this Gil project and I want to add a dependency, rather than loading it like I've done now, I could just say add the dependency. So something like apr.add and then the name of the dependency. And it knowing that you're working on this project will add it to its configuration file and you're done. Right. I think we've gone through this enough. And I wanted to emphasize that the tools that I've written just to demonstrate the package management is not something that I want to carry on with and overtake. It's just a prototype just to demonstrate where I see us going. Now, the Carlyle group have worked on Acre, which is a project management tool, for many years now. And the latest version, version 4, current version, named Acre Desktop, is doing a lot of the things that I've talked about. It has its own integrated link feature. So it's already mapping from a namespace in your workspace to a folder and bringing in code from source files and updating them when you're changing code in your active workspace. What it doesn't have is the, in regards to this folder workspace link, is that it doesn't have a file system watcher. So it doesn't update the active workspace when an external file is changed. We've had discussions about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or if it should do it automatically or not. Morten is convinced that it's...
I don't think it's something everybody needs to do. It depends on how your application.
Right. And Link does allow you to turn it off everywhere. So you don't need to have that feature.
I want it, but not enforce it.
And another thing that Morten mentioned that Link might do in the future is putting arrays into files as well and keep that link working. Acre Desktop does that already, but it's using its own array notation. So you can store text, what is it? I think they've got, is it char lists for vectors of strings, charmat for, and charvec for a simple string.
If you don't want to edit it through the file system or other external resources, why not just keep them in DCFs?
You mean the variables rather, or the constants, if you like?
Then you can do version.
Yeah, you can't version control if it's not, it's a binary file.
You really need to be aware of the distinction between constants and variables.
Yeah, sorry, I corrected myself. Constants,
yeah.
Constants.
The data for your application doesn't belong to the stuff that you would consider source.
Yeah.
Where it requires data.
Right. So let's see. Where are we? I get a message.
Array is better T name than constant.
Array.
Is a better name than constant.
Right.
Well, that depends. Variables are arrays too.
Okay.
Without proposing a strict distinction, you will, even if you use this to store a constant, you can go in and change your constant. It's a variable.
Paul, you can speak up if you like. It's easier than reading the chat. He didn't manage to. Oh, okay.
I mean, his voice may be working.
Oops, that's me. Okay, where are we? Right. Let's change to users skill. And let's create, I'll quickly demonstrate Acre. So I want to create a new project. There's a user command for that, create project. I'm trying to remember the order of the arguments now. It is taking a path, I hope. Let's create my app. And I want to put it in a space in this workspace, namespace called my app. Right, I got it. So I created a project, and if we look in the file system, I believe I should find my app. There we are. Okay. So there's a APL source folder, there's a git ignore file, which specifies, I think, .acre folder should be ignored. And there's a config file, acre config text, which contains a namespace script defining the properties for the project. Case code on, which essentially is another one of those issues that came up when talking about how to handle naming of functions on the file system. In APL, functions are case sensitive. Names of objects, functions are case sensitive. So you could have the same name but with different casing, and it would happily accommodate them in the workspace. But on the file system, you may not have that distinction. So Windows and Mac, for example, don't. And how do you deal with that? Well, if you want to have one file per function or object, then you either disallow the same name with different casing, or you need to create different file names for the different functions. So
you could have files that just don't have names that correspond to what's inside.
Yeah, you could completely disassociate the file name from the content, which
that's not a funny thing. That's what most programming languages do. They have a single file with some name that describes what the general purpose of this file is, and it has a lot of functions.
But they don't have the one-to-one relationship.
They don't have one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, correct. And then again, you still can't use the same name for, sorry. Yeah, it's a big conversation there as well. But the working assumption that I think we're agreeing on is that we will not take that step of disassociating names from the file name, sorry, the file name from the object name, until such time that Dialog does a rehaul, complete rehaul, and says, to hell with this namespace structure, we'll just use simple files and folders, and you can define your namespace structure in your code. Because other languages, when they create namespaces, they would define the namespace that their functions would go in. So in the file, you would say, here are some functions, and I want them in this namespace. And we don't have that in APL. You see what I mean? Maybe?
You could do it with that trick that we used for the variables. You have this anonymous namespace, and it says hash dot something something dot something something gets this function.
Yeah. Adam suggested we use a hack to accomplish the same thing.
I'm not suggesting you do it. I'm saying you can do it, but it's not.
But essentially, I've thought about it for a long time, and I think it will make it awkward, and it will be quite a breaking or a completely different workflow, and it will be awkward to make that transition. So having a file containing multiple functions where there is no association to the namespace whatsoever, you would need to declare that explicitly in your file. Something like, you know, namespace declaration. Namespace, this, here are the functions. Which I think would just make it more awkward. Anyway, so going back to case code, what that looks like is if I create, let's do my app foo and put a comment or even a comment. It's saved that, and looking in the file system under APL source, I get a function or a file called foo-0.function. And then I do a similar exercise with capital F. And if we then look here in the folder, we see capital F -1. So followed by a dash and then a coding that dictates the case of the casing of the name. So without going into detail, the 0 and 1 is not a sequential number that it creates. It's an actual encoding that dictates the casing of the name. And to demonstrate that, I'll just create one last with a capital O as well. And we'll see that there's a 5. So there's a jump from 1 to 5. Clearly, this isn't a sequential number. This dictates the casing. And I'll give a banana to anyone who can guess this key. There's one left.
You guessed it already? You guessed what it was?
Yes, binary encoding.
Binary encoding.
Yeah, but how exactly?
From left to right?
Foo1. Yeah, it's okay. You won. I'll give you your prize after the presentation.
Are there any left? I think just would be most appropriate if I was connected.
Hooray!
But in which space?
Right. Okay, so that's the case coding. It's caused a little bit of controversy because it does make it look a little bit, well, it's a little bit distracting, I guess. I believe it is important to have this option because of legacy code that might very well have this problem with the same name, different casing. So if you want to allow people to quickly shift their code to source files and then let them refactor at their leisure, you need to support this. I think this is a good compromise. It's not too bad. I believe the Acre team has agreed to turn it off as well. So you have the option of not using the extension, but the discussion is still going on what it should do if you don't use case coding. If you should get warned when trying to fix a new function, or if it will just automatically turn on encoding for that specific function or something. Right. Now, Acre is also taking on a little bit more of the, well, what I was thinking of as a how should I put this, a workspace configuration. There are 2 parameters for load and open where you can specify sibling or cousin folder to open at the same time. So it's like a dependency. I should reiterate that there is no package support in Acre because the package framework itself isn't there. But the concept is very similar. So there's another project that you want to open because it depends on it, or it's using it, or you want to work on them at the same time. The difference between open and load today is only that open would also reflect the changes you make in the active workspace on file, so it would save the changes to file, whereas load is read-only. It just brings it in and doesn't update the external files. So, and apart from that, we've got startup, which is quadlx, more or less. So when you load this or open this project, execute that line. Right. Paul, is there anything else you want me to mention about Acre? Well, it's quiet, so I guess I'll give him a minute or so to respond. I've used Acre to explore the ideas and more as a, what is it called? More as a sounding board to help the Acre team move forward. I haven't used it in an active project as such, but I like it. It's really nice, and I think it's a very good start on where we want to be. The only thing missing in Acre Desktop is the package management, and I'm not 100% clear on where we're going with that myself. Hopefully, we will, as Morten said, agree on a standard way of writing things to source files. Acre Desktop is actually used in the business today. I think Paul Mansur is already writing or has already written build tools to be able to deliver his projects to his customers using Acre Desktop as a basis. My hope is that we will end up, or Acre Desktop at some point might make use of Link under the hood to make it more, what is it called, standardized. Because what I haven't shown yet is I've only created functions. And of course, if we were to create other objects, you'll quickly see what Morten was talking about. Let's see, is this, oh no, I need to give it a proper name. So a proper name is my class. And we'll see that a class gets the .class extension. And similarly with namespace script, it gets the script extension, and operators, and as we said, constants or arrays have their own extensions. Of course, it's really nice to have that extension, because if you're just looking in the folder or on GitHub, you can quickly see what that item is or contains without having to open the file. You can sort or filter or quickly extract the files that are of relevance to you. So being able to sort by extension or kind, I'm not sure how that works in Mac. Apparently this is...
Oh, it's a Java class.
Yeah,
there you go.
dot class is associated with Java. Dot function is a document. Presumably it's not associated with anything. And I suspect script is associated with bash or something. I don't know, shell scripts. I have no idea. But they're not suitable because of these. There are already file associations made to these extensions, and it makes it awkward to work with. So it would be good if we could come up with a set of extensions that are not unique, but rarely used and consistent and easily identifiable. And once we've settled on those file extensions, work will need to be done to propagate those file associations to GitHub and dialog interpreter, etc., to make it easier to work with them. Have I mentioned the two main concerns you had with Acre? Or were there any other points, Morten? Case coding and extensions is what I remember.
My main concern about Acre is the same thing that we've had a bit of discussion about, EPL-centric core philosophy of it. Assume that you're basically an APL programmer and it's not static resource.
Right.
That's really the only.
But there
concern.
isn't that big a step because Acre has
But I
created
think
this.
it's fine that there is a project management system that has that view. I just think there also needs to be a way for APL programs to work.
Yeah. Well, I think this doesn't conflict with anything. You could have other languages here. It isn't completely APL centric in what it does.
What would happen if there was a Java class file in the same program?
Well, what I mentioned before, I think there should be a clean separation between APL source code and other stuff. And as long as, I mean, there's a convention here. APL source is where you put your source code.
There you are.
Yeah, but I mean, that could be configurable. You could change that and say in Acre config text, you define the...
A sense of APL centricness.
But I mean, even if you had JavaScript and other languages here, APL source isn't a bad name for where you put your source code for APL.
Yep.
I mean, there's no APL centricness in this. It would be more APL centric if you took my approach and just said source. Here is at least, you know, I'm open for other languages to come in, but here's where I live.
Imagine if you were an application which consists of APL tasks
Mm-hmm.
and a, shall we say, KDB task. And it's something to communicate on but they are both the same application. The two processes do different same application. I can see that Acre is going to keep my source code, manage that very nicely. But I would want it also to manage my KDB source code. In terms of organizing the project structure, I'm fairly sure I'd have all the stuff that goes in the build process under sibling folders, all the stuff that goes in the KDB process. Do you see any issues in arranging that?
Right, for the benefit of the audience here, Stephen was asking if there was a way to keep two different languages source in the same project folder as siblings almost. And whether this Acre project would have a problem with organizing the code to manage that.
What if there was a sibling folder next to the APL source called K-source?
That's fine. I don't think it,
just ignore it.
no. There's some conventions put in that I don't know how set in stone it is yet, but having what I called assets in a files folder and putting all your files there. And let's see what Paul says. Yeah. Okay, the Acre project folder is the GitHub repository. The APL source folder is just where the APL code goes. And he's also mentioned the Acre tools project, which is containing the build tools for Acre projects. But no, I mean, there is nothing to prevent you from putting a K source folder there with all your stuff and have a K build script file there as well. The idea is that the project folder is the top folder for your project. So when you commit to Git or SVN, that's the top level. But I don't see that that needs to be the top level in itself anyway. I mean, if you wanted to keep everything related, just thinking out loud here, Paul, if you have a project that involves 3 different languages and they're related, I don't see why you couldn't create a Git repository for your project and keep the APL part in a subfolder of that completely in isolation of everything else. What you'd need to...
That's how I'd organize it when I imagine my multi-process application have sibling folders for the different processes, because the source code never overlaps with that.
Yeah.
So in thinking about that, you perhaps imagine just having APL manage the APL portion of it rather than the whole thing.
Yes. In that scenario, yes. I think the only thing you need to worry about is the git ignore. If you're nesting it, you may want to add your acre configuration file to your top level git ignore so it doesn't get committed.
I wonder, must they write a project manager from scratch? Are you looking for writing an extension to some existing project manager? NetBeans, whatever. I don't know what
Extension. Okay, the question is if we have considered writing extensions to existing project managers. The answer is no. I haven't. I think the take on this has been very much APL centric in the sense that we need to do some specific things for APL. And the fact that you want to load it into the interpreter is sort of, doesn't it force you to do it in APL? I mean, you want to make sure that everything gets loaded into a structure in the active workspace and you want to establish links, etc. It's very APL centric.
Yeah, I mean, APL is very special in that you have this long-running interpreter task contained in active workspace. Almost any other programming language would be edit, compiling, and then running some test, and then you'd be done.
Yeah.
You might debug as you went. But you wouldn't have this workspace with stuff in it consistent out. I think that's fundamentally different.
Maybe the couple of languages that do that indeed don't communicate with the world outside. Do not store their code in text files. Like I think of Welcome language, Mathematica. Mathematica is a real workspace, which are binary files where everything goes and is fiercely opposed to communicating with anything outside of it.
Thanks. Very good answers. So APL is unique in being so dynamic.
Almost unique.
Well, for what it's worth, the KDB session shares this characteristic of session which exists for a long time. And the common practice there is that there's a system command simply runs script and re-execute. So my typical workflow is going to be editing my script in a text editor, and then we load that. If I get annoyed by all the detritus that I've accumulated in the session, I'll simply terminate it and start a new script.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think K sort of from the outset has been much more of a microservice architecture through the nature of what K is.
Yeah. Right. I don't know if everyone saw Paul's message, but yes, he agreed that, yes, there's nothing to stop you from putting or littering your project folder with whatever stuff you want to put in there, as long as there is an APL source folder with your APL code in it and the configuration file is there.
That's good.
Then
I have no reservations.
Right. Good. Okay. Well, I think I've talked and showed everything I had on this subject. I'll just go back to see if there was anything I missed, but I don't think so. But going through this quickly, the bits that we have or almost have, link, I'm going to say Morten will have it sussed in no time with maybe some limited functionality, but the core functionality should be there soon. And if you're using Acre, of course, it's already there. It has, there's an overlap in what Link does and what Acre does. There are some things that only exist in Acre, and there are some things that only Link can do. The APR client now, going back, that's a packet repository. we want to implement some sort of a package repository server that I would like to see being public. At least there should be a public one, especially if we want to encourage the newcomers or the existing APL community to start exploring libraries developed by others. The APR client is simply the tool to access the repository. I envisage the APR server will have a RESTful API. It doesn't have to be written in APL. It could be written in any other language. It would sit in the cloud. When we reach the 1 million user base, then we will probably benefit from cloud hosting and load balancing and things. So in the future, we'll have lots of issues with this. A server would, of course, need to check the package. So make sure that it contains what it ought to contain. So the minimum requirements of it needs a configuration file, it needs some source code or whatever. And of course, when it comes to publishing things, if Morten publishes Conga and I go in and say, there's a new version of Conga 4, publish, and it's malicious code, extracting all your details and sending them to me, that would be awful. So of course we would need to have user accounts so an author gets restricted access to his own packages and only he and his collaborators can publish to that package. Right, private public packages is simply the notion of being able to commit things to the cloud repository, but that is restricted to specific users. So in theory, you could have your own packages there that no one else can access, but you can access them from anywhere.
As much as of what GitHub does?
What do you mean? Yeah. Yes, you can have private repositories, if that's what you mean. Yeah, the difference with this GitHub is that when you publish something to the repository, it checks that the package is what is it called, conforming, and you can use shorthands for. I mean, you can use version controls and things in a much easier way, because the version numbers and descriptions of the package will be managed by the package repository server.
It's more similar to Docker Hub or Maven, probably, right? So it's like a repository with all the libraries. And so
yeah, it's specific to the actual packages, where GitHub is more about a project repository. This would be a package repository. I mean, this exists in the Node community as well. You work on a Node project, a JavaScript project. You keep your code in GitHub. You can create releases there, but you also publish your package to NPM, which is the Node package manager. And from then on, others can consume the package without going to GitHub. Right. Yeah, okay, gone through that already. And that's the example that I think this is what I again stole from NPM, but there are commands like this where you can say, load Conga version 3, and it loads it. Find date. I know I need some date package, but without having to go online and looking for it, it says, okay, I found 2 packages, date and time by APL team and dates by dialog. Can you tell me more about date and time? It's functions for manipulating date and time related stuff in dialog APL. Here are the versions available, repository, and what dependencies does it have? And lots of more information. So in theory, being able to browse packages and quickly add them without having to leave the comfort of RIDE or the dialog interpreter. And of course, also being able to publish straight from the command line. I'm done, I'm happy with this, publish, and it does what it needs to do.
Where are these information supposed to be?
Which information?
You're looking for date and you have these 2.
Ah, right. This is the APR server.
Okay.
So an author publishes a package, it is registered there. The server keeps track of all this information and has the zipped package available. And with the RESTful API, you can query what packages are available, and you can also download them. The act of bringing them into the workspace is then managed by link or whatever. Yeah. Okay, I think that was it. So we've seen examples of how this could work. There are some tricky bits of how you wire it up and what should go where, and reference points to where you are in your code. And this is things I think we'll get used to. I'm not saying it's difficult, but it's a different way of viewing how you access things. And I think we still need to think about relocatable code. So we need to write the code in a way that isn't all-knowing, assuming that you can grab something from hash because that's how you've written your code before. You need to think of package development, at least as a tool. You need to think of your space only. This is where I live. I only know about this, and any dependencies I can assume will be available to me as neighbors. But you can't make assumptions about where you are in the workspace.
Yeah, there's a chicken and egg problem there, because when you have the package manager, it's much easier to do that. But until we have it.
Yeah, I mean, until you have the APR and APM, this is a non-issue. Once that's in place and you start developing new projects or migrate existing projects, this is where these are some of the things you need to be aware of. You most likely need to rewrite, refactor, and change things in your existing libraries to fit that model.
And unfortunately, the codex path and the array notation, so things impact this.
The delivery of that.
Significantly when they become available.
Yes, and until such time. Yeah, I mean, in terms of what you showed with Conga, there was an error table that you built as a CSV file. In the meantime, I mean, you could do the Acre approach, build your own array notation, or use Acre that already has its own array notation until such time, and then convert it. Or you can completely move that to your assets folder. I'm going to refer to it that way. Keep it as a CSV file or whatever, and on initialization, you read it in and say, this is the error table for Conga. Having a reference to the root of the project and just using quad CSV or quad JSON to read in constants is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if those configuration items are shared amongst projects. And as we said, you know, if you have K and APL both using the same error table, it wouldn't make sense to put that in an array notation on the APL side, because it would be completely useless to the K task. It would be better to have a standard format like CSV or JSON, keep it in a separate location, folder called config files, whatever, and read it in independently from both.
I like that, much better than assets.
We can call it files, which was Acre's name. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Files is, or stuff,
Other stuff.
or data.
How about content?
Content, yeah.
Yeah.
Or just folder, new folder.
Brand new one. Folder with a space. Done. Yes, I'm done.
In a couple of years, it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see this in the near future. I suspect that the work involved will probably not see it till next year. And if we can get more voices involved in the work group, I mean, at the moment there's, I think, 3 parties involved. So, you know, your specific requirements. I look at you. You represent SimCorp here. I look at you. Oh, there are other SimCorpers here, but you're closer. But essentially, I think we'll need to find a middle ground where we cater for many cases, but maybe not all, where those extremes will have to have custom solutions. I think it would be over-ambitious to find a project manager that ticked all the boxes for everyone in its core form. But being able to extend on it and customize it is important.
Like you have with Link.
Like you have with Link. Yeah. Any questions? In which case I will shut down and then we'll set up for Adam.
Take a little break so I can
Yep.
set my screen resolution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.